gardening without pesticides. It's something that we all aspire to do, we all strive to do, but how do you actually do it? Now, if you're like me, you may be frustrated because in the past you've been on other creators' pages and they claim to be pesticide free and yet they recommend pesticides. Now, those may be organic pesticides, but a pesticide is a pesticide. For example, neem oil. So today we're going to talk about alternatives to pesticides in the garden and how we do it and how we're able to harvest flowers and vegetables and produce without using any pesticides, including organic ones. Let's go. So it's best to start planning now for your pesticide-free garden. There are three main keys that I'm going to talk about today that are going to help set you up for a good pest-resistant garden. Now, first of all, I want to talk about the term pest, okay? To us, we think of pests as something that is eating our garden, something that's being detrimental to our plants, maybe killing our plants. Now, remember that in nature, pests are still part of the ecosystem. This is something that I teach my 3- and 6-year-old. They even know at their age that grasshoppers and earwigs and aphids, even though they can do damage to plants, are part of the ecosystem. So we need to change our mindset, first of all, around the idea of what a pest is. A pest is food for a beneficial insect. So let's change our mindset, first of all, to remembering that pests serve an important ecosystem purpose. If we are lacking the pests in our garden, we are not going to have the beneficial population that's going to build the biodiversity that is going to make our garden more resilient. So if we don't have the pests, we don't have the beneficials. If we don't have the beneficials, we don't have a resilient garden, okay? It takes all of these things to make a resilient garden, including things like aphids and earwigs and all that stuff. And the way to get rid of them is not through applications of pesticides, even organic ones. So I'm going to start by talking about the 3 overarching themes. We're going to delve a little bit more into each of these during this video. Number 1, biodiversity. Creating biodiversity in your garden is the first step towards safeguarding against pests and making sure you have a well-rounded ecosystem. The second thing we're going to be talking about is plant health. Plants that are healthy are much more resistant to pest damage, and they're much more resistant to being impacted by a pest in the first place. And the third one is ecosystem, the garden ecosystem, and looking at the garden as a whole, looking at the different levels of the soil food web and evaluating what is missing if we are having pest problems in the garden. So first, let's start with number 1, which is biodiversity and building biodiversity into your garden. A lot of times we get very bogged down with companion planting and the idea behind companion planting that X has to be planted with Y, but Y can't be planted with Z. It gets very confusing and overly complicated. Don't worry so much about X goes with Y. Think biodiversity. Lots of different plants in one area. I know that it can look really nice to see a row of lettuces or a row of beans or a group of plants in all one row, but that is not how nature grows, and that's not going to build biodiversity into your garden. What's going to build biodiversity into your garden is interplanting a few things. You may have seen videos on this before where they recommend planting sweet alyssum, for an example. Yes, it attracts beneficial insects. However, sweet alyssum is actually a non-native if you're in North America, and the downside of it being non-native is that it actually is invasive in a couple areas, California, Hawaii, warmer climates. So it's not going to do your ecosystem in your garden any favors. It's actually going to be detrimental to biodiversity as that sweet alyssum spreads, forms a carpet, drops seeds, and starts to overtake other plants that are important for building biodiversity. What I like to recommend, instead of recommending non-native plants, is recommending native plants. Native plants are going to be much better at attracting beneficial insects to your garden. So there are a couple tips I'm going to give you. One is that if you are going to be including native plants that tend to spread, so things like yarrow, goldenrod, mountain mint, monarda, bee balm, those are great for attracting beneficial insects, but they do tend to spread a little bit. So if you are going to be using those native plants as a way to increase the native biodiversity in your garden, give them their own space. Use them as perimeter perennial plantings. Instead of planting yarrow in with your annual plants, because yarrow is going to spread, it might choke out some of your native planting area, use it as perimeter plantings. Use it in your landscaping, in your front yard, in your backyard, as a perimeter around your annual garden. That's a great way to use those more aggressive spreading native plants. A lot of these will self-seed, so you do have to keep up on them somewhat, but you are going to be much happier if you interplant with native plants instead of non-native and possibly invasive aggressive plants. When we're shooting for a biodiverse garden, what I usually recommend is not planting things in clusters. For example, planting all of your tomatoes in one area and not interplanting any kind of flowers or native plant or herb in that area, because that's going to create a target. So say you get tomato hornworms in your garden, you have 20 tomatoes planted right next to each other, that tomato hornworm can have a very lovely feast. If you have spread out your tomatoes and interplanted with a lot of different things, you are building inherent biodiversity and protection from pests into your garden. The other benefit of planting with biodiversity in mind is that you're also going to build in disease resistance. So for example, if you have a bunch of squash planted next to each other and one gets powdery mildew, it very quickly and easily spreads to the other ones. Best to spread those things out, not plant them all in one area, plant them with a lot of different things. Not only is it more beautiful, you get a greater array of beneficial insects, you get more disease resistance. It's a win-win all the way around. So if you want to grow pesticide-free, biodiversity is my #1 tip for assisting with that. The second key that I'm going to be giving you today is plant health. Plant health often gets overlooked. When we're looking at plants that tend to get attacked by insects, insects actually usually target weaker plants because they're easier for them to consume. Now, unhealthy plants can happen for a few different reasons. One, it can happen because you're planting root-bound seedlings. This is why I like to soil block. Soil blocking creates inherently more healthy roots and roots that are ready to hit the ground and spread out rather than continue to circle, which leads to weaker plants with less nutrient uptake availability. So starting with healthier plants is going to inherently build in pest resistance to that plant. The other key with plant health is to not over-fertilize. But a lot of us tend to over-fertilize with nitrogen. Even if it's just organic, it can be organic fertilizers. Fish emulsion, compost can be a source of over-fertilization. If we over-fertilize our plants, we often get a burst of green growth, and it's very quick and rapid green growth in the spring. That is when our plants are going to be more vulnerable and susceptible to things like aphid damage. So if we're getting a big burst of green growth in the spring because we're over-fertilizing, that's going to lead to more aphid damage. So keeping in mind that we don't want to be over-fertilizing, that's going to help with pest resistance in the garden naturally. And the other thing to remember with plant health is if there is something that you've been struggling with growing because of your climate, because of pests that are in your ecosystem, then you just might want to back away from planting those things. I hear this a lot with squash bugs. Squash bugs are eating my garden every year. They are nesting in your soil. You might need to take a couple of years and not plant squash in your garden. Then after a couple years, once that population has declined, then you can plant squash again. But sometimes there are just things that are not meant for our zone. They are not meant for our garden. It is a struggle. Roses are a great example of this. If you have Japanese beetles, without using horrible heavy pesticides, it's really difficult to get rid of Japanese beetles. So you know what? I still have some rose plants here and there. At this point, they're mostly trap crops. I don't really harvest that many roses during Japanese beetle season, and that's just something I have to live with. So bear in mind realistic expectations for your zone and what you want to plant. And the third tip I'm going to give you is ecosystem building. So when we think of the garden, especially when we're thinking of trying to build a garden that is resilient and that doesn't require pesticides, building the ecosystem of that garden and looking at what is missing from the ecosystem of that garden is really important. I always like to start at the bottom of the soil food web and work my way up. So looking at the soil food web, do I have good levels of microbial life in my soil? Am I limiting my soil disturbance so that I'm letting that microbial life thrive? So this kind of starts at the bottom of the soil food web. Do we have plant roots in place most of the season? Okay, this is key #1. This is where cover cropping can come in really handy. Go back and watch our video on spring cover cropping if you want to check that out. I'll do another one this summer on how to do it in the summer into fall. But keeping living roots in the soil as often as possible so that we're feeding that bottom rung of the soil food web. Plant roots, that's what our microbes feed off of. That's what our mycorrhizal fungi use. If we don't have those plant roots in place, we're not going to have the soil life in place that we need. The arthropods, worms, centipedes, decomposers, shredders, if those aren't present, the next layer of our soil food web is also going to be missing. We get all the way up to one that is often forgotten, which are the birds. And birds are so important for the pesticide-free garden. If we are forgetting about the bird layer of the soil food web, then we are missing a huge opportunity. And putting out a bird feeder is not sufficient. It's not enough. We have to be planning for that piece of the ecosystem because those birds are really key for eating things like the larva of the squash vine borer. Caterpillars are a primary feed of young birds. If you have a lot of caterpillars, instead of relying on BT or neem oil to kill off all those caterpillars, let them serve as an attractant to your birds. Plant native berry and seed producing plants. Things like echinacea, golden currant, chokecherries, chokeberries, gooseberries. Those are all great plants for birds and specifically meant to attract birds to your garden. Carve out a space that is dedicated to planting for birds in your garden. Provide them with a water source. Make sure that you have native plants that are good for hosting their nests. You know, as much as we can say, oh, I bought bird food or I put in a birdhouse, those things don't take the place of the role of the native plants, specifically the bird-supporting native plants in the garden.
So these are actually little tulle or organza bags that we buy just to protect the blooms. So because we are a spray-free, pesticide-free flower farm, we don't like to spray anything, especially anything that is going to affect our bee population. So instead, we just use a physical barrier so that those pests can't damage our blooms. That's just a bag, and we just cinch it and pull it right down over the head. So I'll show you what that looks like. As we loosen it, and then we just pop it right up and over, and then we have a nice perfect bloom. So usually we put these bags on right about when those buds are starting to turn color. So right about as those buds start to color out is when they're the most susceptible, or just when they're starting to open. So we just slide that bag right over the top and then cinch it nice and tight, high up on the stem. You don't want to cinch it so tight that you're going to snap that head, but you do want to keep it tight so that earwigs, grasshoppers, Japanese beetles, any of those garden pests aren't able to get to the head and damage the petals. You also want to make sure this bag is sitting up high. If this bag is sitting down low, as these petals develop, it's going to be asymmetrical. So you want to give that bud a lot of nice room to really expand.
But this is a very brief overview. Remember that we have to start by resetting our expectation for our garden to look perfect and to look pristine, and to bear in mind the fact that part of having a garden that is serving as a part of the ecosystem means that some of it is going to be lost to some kind of pest. It is unrealistic to expect that our gardens will always be pest-free. They will always be perfectly producing. We will never have any pest damage. It's just not realistic. So be realistic with your expectations, but you will have a much happier and healthier garden experience for yourself and for your pollinators and your ecosystem if you go pesticide-free this year. I hope this video is helpful for you. If you have any questions, pop them down below. I'm happy to help with what I can. And please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps us out a lot here at the farm. Thanks, guys. See you next time.